Right. And Lyosha, why don't you just introduce yourself and then we'll get started.
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Lyosha. I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm in 11th grade and been interested in linguistics since I was around 9, I think. And I've taken various linguistics classes at universities and colleges. That's about it. Yeah. So without further ado, I guess let's start. Welcome to this 30-minute lecture on phonology and phonetics. I kind of want to put a disclaimer kind of in the beginning that this is a very obviously, this is intended for people who have no knowledge of phonology or phonetics at all. And so if you have a sort of cursory knowledge of phonology and phonetics, this might not be as useful to you. But with that aside, let's begin. So what are some sounds humans can make? I mean, presumably a lot, right? I think we can all think of a lot of sounds that humans can make. What if I told you that I can show you all the sounds human languages use? Drum roll, please. Here we are. Okay, ta-da. So, okay, you might have a number of questions seeing this, probably something along the lines of, what is this and what are these characters? And I promise I will answer this question, but first I want to talk about spelling. I know, fascinating topic, but bear with me. English spelling is awful. I think we probably all know this because we had to go through the process of learning how to write, and I think we all sort of discovered these problems with English spelling. But let's kind of look at English spelling and see some of the problems that it has. So one is that a single sound may be represented with many different letters or combinations of letters. So, for example, we have these words sleeve, leave, even, seize, siege, and key. These words all have the same sound, this E sound, but it's spelled differently in every single one of these words, right? First with EE, then EA, then just E, then EI, IE, and EY. That's probably not the best system, is it? And it gets worse because the same letter or combination of letters can represent a number of different sounds. So there's the notorious OUGH sequence in English. So in all of these words, we have OUGH, but it's pronounced differently every single time. We have though, tough, trough, through, thought, and thorough. What is this madness? This is terrible. A combination of letters may represent a single sound. So in these words, latch, amoeba, phenomenon, soup, wrist, and education, the underlined letters, right? There's more than one, but they represent a single sound. It's not very efficient. A single letter may represent a combination of sounds. This doesn't happen as often in English, but we have this letter X, which can represent 4 different combinations of sounds. So we have the words taxation, example, luxury, and anxious. In the first case, represents the sounds K and sounds K and S, then G and Z, then G and J, and then K and Sh. And sometimes some letters may not have any pronunciation at all. Right? So we have these words salmon, doubt, mortgage, sword, cupboard, and mnemonic. The underlying letters are not pronounced at all. Like, why do we even write them? So, okay, how do we resolve this issue, right? Clearly, this is not the best way that we can represent sounds graphically. There must be a better way to do this, right? And so the solution is the International Phonetic Alphabet. This is an alphabet with symbols to transcribe any sound in a language unambiguously. It's called IPA for short. No, it's not the beer. This is a different IPA. It was created in the 19th century by a group of linguists. And with the knowledge of the IPA, you can pronounce any word in any language, basically. I put the disclaimer there because the IPA tells you how to pronounce any word. Whether you can actually pronounce the sounds is a separate issue. But yeah, the logic is basically one symbol for each sound. And it is a way that you can transcribe any sound in any language unambiguously. So to show you an example of this, let's go back to our set of OUGHs. And here are the words on the left, and on the right are the words spelled in the IPA. And notice that in English, right, we use OUGH in every single one of these words. And in the IPA, they're spelled quite differently because obviously they're pronounced quite differently. So I promise we will get more into the IPA a bit later. But first, I want to talk a bit about how people make sounds in general. And so to see how this works, let's slice somebody's head in half. I know, very morbid, but here we go. This is what it would look like if you took somebody's head, I guess, and cut it down vertically. And now we have this sort of diagram of places of the mouth and sort of surrounding areas. And these are places of articulation. What I mean by this is that these are places where humans can produce sounds that are used in languages. And so let's sort of systematically go through this chart. So labeled 1 and 2 are the lips. Sounds involving lips in some way are called labial. And sounds involving both lips are called bilabial. So examples of these sounds are p, m, and b. If you try and pronounce these sounds, you'll notice that you're actually using your lips when you pronounce them. And in the cases of p, m, and b, you're actually using both of your lips, right? You're kind of pressing your lips together and releasing, right? These are bilabial sounds, right? These are sounds that involve using both of your lips. Labeled 3 on this chart, we have teeth, the teeth. Sounds involving the teeth are called dental. Sounds that involve both the lip and the teeth are called labiodental. So some examples of dental sounds in English are th and the. When you pronounce these sounds, you might notice what you're doing is you're basically taking your tongue and you're sticking it in between your teeth. For the sounds f and v, these are labiodental sounds because what you're doing is you're taking your lower lip, and pressing it against your upper row of teeth. So in these sounds f and v involve both your lip and your teeth. So they're called labiodental. 4 is the alveolar ridge. So you might not have noticed this, but there's a little ridge behind your teeth. This is called the alveolar ridge. And sounds produced here are called alveolar. So sounds like t, n, d, and s, these are all alveolar sounds because they're produced in that part of the mouth. So if you pronounce these sounds, you'll notice that your tongue is not actually on your teeth, it's a bit behind your teeth. And that is the alveolar ridge. These sounds are called alveolar sounds. Moving on, we have 5, which is post-alveolar sounds. As the name suggests, it's sounds produced behind your alveolar ridge. Sounds in English that are post-alveolar are sh and j. That's what these little strange symbols represent. Those represent those sounds. Sh and j. This is a perfect example of showing how the APA is a bit better at representing sounds than English spelling, because in English to represent the sounds sh and j, we would need 2 letters, S and H in the first case and Z and H in the second case, whereas in the IPA, we represent both of those sounds with one symbol, with one symbol each, right? 6 and 7 is the hard palate, or basically the roof of the mouth. Those terms are synonymous. Sounds produced here are called palatal sounds. There aren't really many in English. One that I can think of is y. So if you pronounce the sound y, which is what this J symbol stands for, if you pronounce the sound y, what you'll notice that you're doing is you're placing your tongue, moving your tongue really, really close to the roof of your mouth and then dropping it back down. And that's a palatal sound. 8 is the velum, or soft palate. So you'll notice this a lot in phonology, phonetics. I think actually just linguistics in general. There are a lot of terms, a lot of concepts that just have 2 words for them, and that's just what it is. So velum and soft palate are actually basically used synonymously. I prefer velums. That's what I will use. But the velum moves up to block the air passage to your nasal cavity. And sounds produced here are called velar sounds. So k, ng, and g are all velar sounds. They're pronounced quite far back in the mouth. You can see where the velum is labeled on this chart with the 8. It's actually quite far back in your mouth. 9 is the uvula. So I don't know if you've ever looked at your somebody else's mouth, or I guess you could look at your own mouth like in a mirror. In the back of your mouth, there's a little dangling thingy that I guess I said here, nightmare fuel tentacle. Sure, I think that's an apt way to describe this. That thing, dangling thing, is called your uvula. And yes, some sounds are pronounced here. There are no uvular sounds in English, but Arabic has some uvular sounds. One example is qa, which it basically sounds like a K, but like really far back in your throat. So if you try to pronounce a K, but like as far back as you can, you might get a uvular qa. It sounds kind of wonky. But then there's 10, which is the pharynx. This is essentially the back of the throat. Sounds pronounced here are called pharyngeal sounds. We're wading kind of into very unfamiliar territory for a lot of English speakers because there are no pharyngeal sounds in English. I will use Arabic as an example again because Arabic has some pharyngeal sounds. So we have h or a. These are kind of fun to pronounce, I think. You're basically kind of semi-choking yourself when you pronounce these words just because they're like basically the back of your throat. So you kind of have to squeeze it to pronounce them. 11 is the glottis. It's the space between your vocal cords. Sounds produced here are called glottal sounds. The only glottal sound in English is h, like an H sound. You might not know this, but it's actually pronounced super far down your throat, basically. What you're doing is you're just kind of breathing, but you're constricting it a bit so it produces a sound other than just like exhaling. 12 is the epiglottis. So this is a flap that closes when you swallow so you don't accidentally start breathing food. It kind of severs your food pipe so that, your air pipe. So when you eat, food doesn't go into your lungs. There are epiglottal sounds. Unfortunately, this is where my pronunciation expertise ends. I can't pronounce any epiglottal sounds at all. But if you want to see some people pronouncing epiglottal sounds, you could just search, I guess, epiglottal consonant, and I'm sure somebody can oblige you. 14 and 15 are the tongue. Sounds produced with the tongue are called lingual sounds. 16 is a tongue blade. Sounds produced here are called laminal. And 17 is tongue tip. Sounds produced here are called apical. Now, the last three aren't as important. And the reason this is because pretty much every sound is produced with the tongue. And so calling a sound lingual is kind of not very helpful. It's same kind of with laminal and apical. The only times these are really used is if you want to kind of differentiate that. Well, I'm producing a T with my tongue blade or tongue tip. So this is actually a laminal or an apical T. That's usually the only times that these terms are used. Okay, so these are our places of articulation. So just for review, I also just want to cover a bit briefly what vowels and consonants are. So a consonant is a sound that obstructs the flow of air in some way. So any sound that obstructs the flow of air in some way is a consonant. And a vowel is just, well, if you scream, just like keep your mics off properly, but just scream, that'll be a vowel. It's any sound that you make when the flow of air is not obstructed at all. Okay, so next we're going to talk about manners of articulation. We talked about places of articulation, right? Places in the mouth where humans produce sounds for language. There are also different manners of articulation, different ways that we produce sounds. So the first is called stops or plosives. This is another place where there are just two terms that are used interchangeably. So stops or plosives are produced when the airflow to the mouth is interrupted completely. I have a kind of neat GIF or GIF, however you choose to pronounce it. And yeah, so if you pronounce the following sounds, p, t, k, b, d, g, these are all stops or plosives. When you pronounce these sounds, you notice that you basically you have just an obstruction in your mouth. What you're doing is you're basically gathering up air in your mouth and then releasing it all at once, right? You're generating an obstruction, then releasing it. And where this obstruction happens determines the kind of stop or plosive that you have, right? So with p, we form this obstruction with both your lips. In fact, this this GIF or GIF is for the sound p or b. For t or k, the obstruction is located somewhere else in your mouth. But the key thing that the unites all stops or plosives is that there's some obstruction in your mouth that interrupts the airflow completely, entirely, and then you release it again. There are also nasal stops, which are kind of a subset of stops or plosives. They're identical to stops, but the velum is lowered so that air can pass through your nose. So some examples are m, n, and ng. So this last n with a little tail is the ng sound. It's usually written in English as ng. But yeah, all of these sounds are pronounced with the air flowing through your nasal cavity. And this is why if you actually just like pinch your nose, if you try pinch your nose to pronounce m, n, ng, you notice you're basically kind of, you end up sort of pronouncing b, d, g. And the reason is because those are basically what you're doing. And if you pinch your nose, air can no longer flow through your nose, so you can't pronounce those sounds. There are also fricatives. Fricatives are produced when there's a tight constriction in your mouth. They're kind of between a stop and a vowel. So some examples of fricatives are s, z, f, v, h, and sh. And so with fricatives, there's a constriction. It's not a full obstruction. And what this means is that air can keep flowing through. This is why you can say s or f, and you can just do that, as long as you want until you run out of air. But with a stop, you can't do that. I can't say I can't do that because I stop the air. When you say the sound, you stop the air completely. It can't keep going. But the fricatives, the key thing is that the air keeps flowing, but there's the constriction somewhere in your mouth that changes the quality of the sound. Then there are affricates. These are sounds that begin as a stop, but are released as a fricative. So here are some examples. We have ts, z, ch, and j. So notice these sounds are kind of, you're pronouncing basically for the sound like ch. You're basically simultaneously pronouncing a t and a sh. And we treat this different than if you just pronounce a t followed by a sh. It actually sounds different if you think about it. So ch versus sh. There's a different sound because the first one you're pronouncing at the same time, and the second one you're pronouncing one followed by the other. This is why in the IPA, we indicate this by putting a little sort of, it's called a tie, but it looks like a little, I guess, upside down parenthesis over the letters to indicate that they're pronounced at the same time. There are also approximants, liquids or glides. These are also kind of vague terms. It depends on where you find them. They could mean sort of slightly different things, but effectively they're all sort of close to a fricative, but never quite enough constriction to produce a fricative. And so they therefore produce sort of a liquid-like sound. They're usually basically in between fricatives and vowels. So some examples are l, w, y, and r. These are all approximants or liquids or glides. There are also flaps or taps, another pair of synonymous terms. This is a type of consonant where usually the tongue is kind of thrown apart to the mouth. So there are no flaps or taps in English. So Spanish has a tapped R. So I'm actually really bad at pronouncing this, but someone like r, where your tongue just kind of flaps once at the roof of your mouth, producing this sound. There are also trills, which is when a part of the mouth flaps back and forth aggressively, I think is a good way to put this. So Spanish actually has a different type of R. It also has a trilled R, which sounds like r, where instead of flapping only once, tongue flaps a lot of times. You can also have kind of an R, but further back in your mouth. This becomes a uvular trill. So something like r. You can also blow a raspberry, and that is also a trill. So dr is a perfectly fine trill. You're just using your lips. So it's called a bilabial trill. And there are also clicks. So clicks are kind of weird. And they're also really hard to define. It's basically moving air through the mouth using various parts. They're super rare in languages. They usually only occur in like languages spoken in South Africa and a few other places in the world, but they're very rare cross linguistically. But here are some examples of clicks. The first, the one that looks like an O with a dot in the middle, is a bilabial click. So something like this, basically like if you pretend to kiss somebody, that's a bilabial click. Gosh, I actually forget these next two. One is the alveolar click and one is a dental click. So one is like if you're trying to imitate a horse, you produce a sound. So like I think this is the alveolar click. Yeah, and dental click is like in English, if we try to show disappointment or something, if you make the tisk sound, like that's a dental click. And the last is a lateral click. I think this means something in equestrian sports, but like is a lateral click. They're kind of really odd sounds, and so it maybe is understandable why they're pretty rare in languages. So now that we've covered places and manners of articulation, let's see if we can decipher the consonant table of the IPA. So I'm just looking at the clock and I realize we only have 5 minutes left. So I'm going to skip this part. This is not as important. I want to cover what voice means, like what are voiceless and voiced sounds. So voicing is this difference between this word staple and stable. The first contains the voiceless sound p, and the second one contains the voiced b. So to see kind of how voicing works, I want you to pretend to be a snake, basically. So you can place your hand on kind of your throat like this and just hiss, right? So like, if you do that, nothing interesting should really happen. But I want you to do the same thing, except this time alternate between a sound and a z sound. So sound something like something like this. And so you might notice that if you do that, when you pronounce the z sound, your throat kind of vibrates. And those are your vocal cords, right? And so when your vocal cords vibrate, that's what voicing is. That's the difference between a sound like p and b. The first one doesn't have your vocal cords vibrating. The second one does. And so when you're whispering, that's specifically when you're not vibrating your vocal cords. That's why everything when you whisper is voiceless. Trying to think how best to use the rest of the time. Let's talk about vowels really quickly. So vowels are really hard to classify. The reason is because if you move your tongue slightly, you just get a different vowel. This is why vowels are the hardest to imitate. So if you're learning a foreign language, vowels are the hardest things to get right because they're just so hard to pin down, and they vary a lot. So what does the vowel chart look like in the IPA? So this is what it looks like. You might have a question, which is why is it shaped so weirdly? And the answer is that all vowels are defined by 3 basic measures. Backness, so whether the tongue is closer to the front or back of the mouth. Height, whether the tongue is closer to the top or bottom of the mouth. You can also think of this as like how open your mouth is. And rounding, so whether the lips are rounded or not when pronouncing the vowel. And this should be, you can see this labeled with this chart, right? The top is the backness, right? We have front, central, and back. And the side of the chart is the height, right? Whether your mouth is closed or open. And the pairs are, so the vowels that are separated by the interpunct are pairs of rounded and unrounded vowels. And so you can see how this works. So the first vowel on this chart is E. It's a closed front vowel. Why is this the case? Well, the mouth is as closed as you can make it without not producing any sound, right? The mouth is very closed when you pronounce sound like E, right? It's very closed. And also your tongue is super far to the front of your mouth. It's also unrounded. Your lips aren't rounded. if you round your lips while pronouncing an E, what happens? Well, it goes E-U. You get the sound U, which is a sound used in languages like French or German. And this is a closed front rounded vowel. It's basically E's counterpart, but it's rounded. And all the vowels on this chart operate in basically the same way. A sequence of two vowels is called diphthong. That we can get a bit crazier. There are triphthongs and quadriphthongs, which are 3 and 4 vowels. So some examples of diphthongs are I, ow, and I. As you can see, they're just basically sequences of 2 vowels. There's also nasalization, which is pronouncing vowels through the nose. So this doesn't happen in English, but a language like French has nasalization. So these vowels, which nasalization in the IP is written by right in this little squiggle, or which is called tilde over the vowels, but these are pronounced on, and on. And yeah, so I was going to talk about suprasegmental and prosodic features, but I think we're out of time, so that's fine. Let me get to the last slide. Oh, excuse me. There we go. Yeah. So thank you, everyone. Here's some list of resources that I have, so you can, I guess, screenshot this slide if you find that useful. Otherwise, that is all.
Yep. Thank you. Very well done. Unfortunately, we do not really have time for questions, but yeah, I'm going to post a link for our Discord server, and Lyosha is on there, I believe, so you can ask him there.
For the, I mean, I know there's a lecture after this. Is it the same link?
It's a different link.
Oh, I mean, people can like.
I'll post the link to our Discord server in the chat, but
I'm fine to stay a bit longer to answer some questions if anybody has them.
Yeah, I have to go moderate that talk, but
okay.
Yeah,
In that
I will
case,
stop the recording.